Hello, I'm Milan Lewiński and you're watching TVP World Talks, where every word matters. In Syria, ordinary citizens rejoice in the streets at the collapse of the long-standing and brutal regime of Bashar al-Assad. However, the international community still doesn't really know what to do about it. There are many possible scenarios which have left people scratching their heads, and none more so than in Moscow. Because apart from the possible new government in Syria, there is also the thorny issue of two military bases that Russia has created and that now may stand to lose if they don't play their cards right. So what's going on the Syrian soil? Will the bases remain? What future awaits Russia's influence there? We're going to talk about this with our guest today, Tara O'Connor, Managing Director at Africa Risk Consulting. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you very much. Hello.
So let us begin with a quote which may actually sound quite ironic. This is from Mikhail Ulyanov, the Russian ambassador to various institutions in Vienna, who often actually takes the floor at the United Nations, much to the dismay especially of Ukrainian representatives. What he said concerning Bashar al-Assad and his arrival to Moscow was that Russia does not betray friends in difficult situations. What do you make of this statement? Because judging by what happened, it seems that, yeah, Russia totally betrays its friends in difficult situations. It considers them, in fact, disposable. Would you agree with that?
I would totally agree with that. And I think the extraordinary collapse of the Assad regime has great lessons, particularly for the clients, Russia's new client states in West Africa. Not only was the speed of the collapse completely took Russia and its allies by surprise, which is an indication that perhaps that Russia is militarily stretched. But secondly, it completely abandoned Syria very, very quickly and urged its population and its military to retreat back to Russia. In fact, including all of its population within the week, suggesting that they return home, evacuate as quickly as possible. So both from the point of view of leaving very quickly, I thought there was something else that was rather ironic, given the appalling scenes that we've seen with the opening up of prisons and the releasing of people from prisons, that actually Russia has given Assad asylum in Moscow on humanitarian grounds. Well, we're seeing evidence of the lack of humanity that has been displayed in the Syrian regime under Assad for now half a century. So that it adds to the irony. But the main lesson really is for the West African client states that are new to Russia, that are newly within the Russian sphere of influence, that actually Russia probably has neither the capacity nor has it really the will to defend its client states in difficult circumstances.
It is perhaps even more ironic that I think Bashar al-Assad was quoted as saying at one point that I am not Viktor Yanukovych. Well, it does seem that he's actually following in his footsteps by accepting Russia's invitation and ending up perhaps living in rather comfortable conditions, somewhere in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Good for him, I guess. However, the problem is that he's doing that at the expense of his people, as he did for many years. So now we're going to take a glance at what's going on in Syria right now. With Bashar al-Assad gone, Russia seemingly is trying to reach out to the new future administration, in fact, to the organizations which have liberated Syrian cities, including Damascus. They're already changing their rhetoric. Do you think this is going to be successful? And do you think that this will allow Russia to hold on to its military facilities in Syria?
I think that's the million-dollar question. And yes, we have seen a pivot very quickly from Moscow to actually try to engage. But alongside Europe, alongside Turkey, I think there is a worldwide rush to actually re-engage with the new rulers in Damascus. And I think that there is now competition for influence. I noticed that today on the news, the British government, for example, is considering lifting restrictions that are lifting its restrictions, and it's having named the new leaders as actually formally named as terrorists, that which precluded them from being able to actually engage. So that will be lifted. And there is a race on everywhere except perhaps amongst the Donald Trump regime, Donald Trump's party, to engage with the new leadership in Damascus with the express view of trying to influence from outside the unfolding transfer of power from the runt of the Assad regime to whatever is coming shortly.
So now the big question, as you said, is also, is it going to be successful? Russia does have a vested interest there. It's not just about the Assad regime, that is gone now, but it is about a couple of military facilities, in particular the Tartus naval base and also the Khmei Mim air base located in the Latakia province. Would you say that the facilities in question are likely to remain? Because what we have now is reports that apparently the rebels are willing to respect, Russian diplomatic missions and facilities. The Russian embassy has not been looted, unlike the Iranian one, for example. But does it mean that the bases are there to stay? Because this does not expressly state, oh yeah, we're going to extend the agreements that were made with the Assad regime. I think it was like a 50-year lease or something like that. It may only mean that we will allow you to evacuate these facilities in an orderly manner, with no violence involved, no risk to personnel. But what happens with these facilities later remains an open question. Are there any signals going this way or the other?
Well, it's very early days to be able to identify any such moves. But what is critical is that it is critical, but for Russia, if Russia is to maintain any kind of presence, it's only, particularly the Tartus base, is Russia's only naval base on the Mediterranean. And without it, we've seen recent moves by Russia to try and expand naval base access to, say, Port Sudan in the Sahel, and develop relationships there. But again, the questions that people being asked by Russia to open up their ports and so on to their influence will be questioning whether this is a wise move given the speed of the retreat this time. But so I think it's very early to say what will actually happen to these two bases. I mean, what's critical for West Africa is that these bases were used to supply, and particularly these bases are used to supply Wagner in West Africa. So for the immediate moment, those strategic links are disrupted, are cut, which could actually have another impact way across the Sahel. So, as I said, I think there is now going to be an enormous amount of international moves to reconnect with the new leadership in Damascus in order to be able to influence the direction of travel. So, as I say, I think there is going to be greater competition. I mean, since those bases were started up, effectively, Russia has since those bases were agreed and established, Russia has invaded Ukraine, has engaged in a prolonged battle against a sovereign nation, which has caused it to be isolated from the rest of the Western world, which is very obvious to say. But as I say, part of the isolation of Russia that will be on the international agenda will be these particular bases as people scramble for influence in Damascus.
And who do you think may actually have better incentives or a greater leverage, if any, on the new upcoming administration in Syria? Because, you know, if there is a new government there, if it's formed fairly quickly, it could act just like the new president of Senegal, who said, we're a sovereign country, we do not want any foreign bases on our territory. And he told the French to basically disengage and to leave their facility. Could the same thing happen in Syria? Or could Russia propose something that could convince the new government to leave these bases well alone?
That is absolutely possible. I mean, we don't have a kind of a policy agenda. I think that we're really at very early stages of actually discovering what the new administration is going to look like. I mean, so far we've actually seen. And I think the great thing that counts against Moscow being able to maintain any influence with the new regime is the very fact that it supported one of the most brutal regimes in the Middle East. And we're now, again, as I said, we're seeing evidence of that as every prison is being opened up and as people start telling their stories and find their loved ones. I think any new government coming in will be very hard pushed to continue a military relationship with a government that actually, with Russia, that actually basically propped up the Assad regime. So I think it's a very hard ask for Russia. But I think the new government's going to be practical because they will need all the support. I think they'll be very practical about these matters, and they will need lots of international support in order to build Syria, to accept returning refugees. And I think the real focus for the new government will be to develop some sort of a system to chart a path to a new political structure. And they seem to be extremely pragmatic at the moment, not taking power, but actually asking of the Prime Minister to actually sign over responsibility. There is no sense that the current administration is in anything but, the actual bureaucracy is in anything but a transition period. And I think that transition period will really start charting a new path. And I don't see that the previous supporters of a brutal and cruel regime as Moscow was will have much leverage. The other thing to note is that the other country that has been very quiet on the collapse of the Assad regime is Russia's new ally in the Middle East, which is the UAE. And Russia and the UAE are actually both engaged in supporting, both with military support and medical support, the RSF rebels in Sudan, creating, again, another humanitarian disaster in that, being being the main contributors to that humanitarian disaster. So that, I think UAE is also being very quiet about the change in government. And I think that's probably a very sensible approach, again, because they are perceived to be allies in supporting of the failed Assad regime.
And one quick question, we only have a minute left. What role can Turkey play in assembling this entire puzzle?
Well, Turkey is a very important player because not only is it first of all, it is a NATO member. It is also its own strategic and security needs are wrapped up in preventing any kind of Kurdish autonomy on the borders of the Syrian plains. Sort of eastern Turkey, Diyarbakir, overlooking the Syrian plains, is very much where Kurdish, there is a strong Kurdish presence and a sort of an independentist or separatist Kurdish movement, which within Turkey is considered one of its greatest security problems. So from both of those points, Turkey has an interest in making a strong a strong appeal to the new leadership in Damascus.
So overall, the situation regarding not just the Russian military facilities, but the entire political puzzle in the region remains as complex as it was, even though the recent developments are actually pushing this story forward in a very rapid manner. Tara O'Connor was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much.
And you're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news and updates.